A very, very warm welcome to everybody. I'm delighted that so many of you have come and are present here physically in the room, and there are also many others who are in attendance virtually, which is why I'm sheltering behind the camera so that they have a better view. I'm really delighted that our speakers and you have taken time out of your busy schedules to be here today and to discuss with us issues of sleep, light, and architecture. I'm Sebastian Klinger. I'm the PI of this network, Sleep and the Rhythms of Life, which I've co-founded during my JRF together with the neuroscientist Russell Foster and the English scholar and cultural historian Sally Shuttleworth. And this network is the first initiative at the University of Oxford to bring together researchers with an interest in sleep across all 4 academic divisions, to bring together people in medicine, to bring together people in the natural sciences, with people in the humanities and people in the social sciences. And the goal is to create a venue for an interdisciplinary exchange that transcends traditional boundaries and to spearhead insights into sleep that are only possible in conversation with these disciplines. And today we're going even beyond these 4 divisions by bringing in Ian Ritchie, who is an architect who combines impeccable engineering with aesthetic sensibilities. So we're having an even broader and more interdisciplinary view of what sleep is or what sleep could be. Before I'm introducing the event today and introducing the panelists, thanks are due. Thanks are due to our funding body and to our host here, the Oxford Center in the Humanities, Torch, who's been working tirelessly together with us to make this possible. So please join me in giving them a warm thank. Thanks is due to Alessandra Aloisi, who made the recording possible. But I'm especially grateful to Russell Foster and to Sally Shuttleworth, both of whom have been very, very, very active in pushing this network and in making it possible that we can assemble and share knowledge, discuss, and learn about questions of sleep and sleep research. And for me, it is obviously also wonderful to learn from people who have so much experience. Today, we're talking about an issue that is not, or perhaps not, the first commonplace that comes into mind when thinking about sleep. And yet, the rhythms of life are obviously in a very intimate way connected to sleep. And rhythms are a concept that ties together various disciplines in various ways. And rhythms are also obviously connected to light. In the sense of the biorhythm is most obvious, but also in terms of architecture that has a very direct way of structuring rhythms of life. So the idea of this event is to have Russell Foster, whom I'm going to introduce in a second, as a distinguished expert on circadian neuroscience, and Ian Ritchie as a world-renowned architect who's sculpting with light, if you will, and share their perspectives on these issues that are talking together so directly. I said that I would introduce our speakers, and now I'm going to do it. So please join me in inviting Russell Foster, who is the head of the Sleep and Circadian Neuroscience Institute at the University of Oxford, and who has not only worked immensely in issues of biorhythms and the circadian rhythms, but has also reached a much bigger audience with his books and articles. And he has published in this May a book called Lifetime, the New Science of the Body Clock and how it can revolutionize your sleep and health. And we're sure that we will be hearing more how this works in our talk. And our second speaker is Ian Ritchie, who is a very distinguished, world-renowned record as an architect. You probably have come across his buildings in London, in Dublin, in Madrid, in Leipzig, in the Oxford Science Park, or if you haven't been to any of these places, then you probably have seen his building or one of his buildings on our poster. And Ritchie is a member of several academies and has won several prizes, and he's also an author and artist. And if I read it correctly in his autobiography, questions of rhythms and of orders are very important to him. So we will be very curious to learn more from you about sleep, light, and architecture. Russell, you're going first.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sebastian, and thank you for your leadership in this entire project. One of the things that I have found very frustrating, as I'm sure many of us do, is I don't know how to work the computer. Oh, there we go. Is these artificial distinctions between the arts and the sciences and the humanities, and the more we break down those artificial distinctions, I think the better. I mean, after all, we're all trying to understand our world, and we're just using different tools. And the greater the synergy between the different disciplines, I think the greater is our potential understanding. So let me now share the screen, if I can remember how to do this. Oh, I think that's working. Yep. Share that. There we go. Wonderful. Okay, so I will restrict my part of the discussion to the importance of light for human sleep and circadian rhythms. And the plan is I'll speak for 15 minutes or so, and then hand over to Ian, and then we'll have a discussion. So, is that working? So I can't advance the slide. Maybe I click on it. Anybody know how to advance the? Ah, there, I just push it hard. God. So starting with posing a question. Do we have enough information to design human-centric lighting, i.e. lighting that incorporates the varied impact of light on our biology for the regulation of circadian rhythms and sleep in the built environment? So that's the question I'm posing. And of course, the organ of light detection is the eye, but it's worth emphasizing that the eye has dual functions. It's, of course, the familiar function is as an image detector, or if vision, so we can see an object against its background, either because of contrast in black and white or because of color. But the less understood, as we'll discuss, function of the eye is as a non-image forming light detection system, or a NIF system, represented here as a gradient of light. What is this system used for? Well, NIF mediates circadian rhythm regulation, and I'll talk about that in a moment, sleep, alertness, mood, pupil constriction, visual sensitivity, metabolism, hormone release, and these various hormones, melatonin, serotonin, dopamine, they all are dependent upon brightness measures from the environment. And I will restrict our discussion really to circadian rhythms and sleep, but we can discuss these perhaps other functions during the discussion period. So if and NIF responses are mediated by the eye, but how? If you think about it, it's a very interesting sensory task. The visual system is grabbing light in a fraction of a second, then forgetting it's seen it to generate an image of our world. Whereas, of course, what the non-image forming responses require is an overall measure of brightness. And it was really coming from that sensory sort of background that I couldn't really understand how the eye could function as both an if and a nif receptor. So just to orientate you, this is, of course, the eye. We've expanded here the retina. And you see that the visual cells, the photoreceptor cells, the cones and the rods, they are responsible for providing an image of our world. But what we showed is that you can take away all of those image-forming photoreceptors, and you can still regulate your biological clock perfectly normally, your circadian rhythms. And what we discovered is that there's a third photoreceptor system within the eye, both based upon these ganglion cells. So there's the rods and cones, the inner retina, and these ganglion cells with their projections form the optic nerve. And about 1 out of every 100 of those ganglion cells is directly light sensitive using a novel photopigment system, a novel light detecting system, which is called melanopsin. And we call these cells PRGCs. Okay. Now, let me just clarify what I mean by entrainment, how the internal day and the external day are aligned. And this is essential because if you're fine-tuning our biology to the varied demands of the light-dark cycle, the rotation of the Earth on its axis, you've got to make sure that you are aligned, that the internal and the external days are working together. So you see here a light-dark cycle, and we see a circadian rhythm here, and you see the peak of the rhythm is occurring at the same time every day. Now let's look at a system whereby there's a very weak light-dark cycle, as often you find in nursing homes, for example, or if you have no eyes, then what happens is that the clock will keep on ticking, but you see that the peak of the rhythm occurs later and later in time. And so this is entrainment, and this would be called free running. Now, entrainment is essential for a stable sleep-wake cycle. And the impact of sleep and circadian rhythm disruption, i.e., if you don't get this robust entrainment, can be summarized in the following slide. So what I've got here is the short-term impact upon our emotional responses with this misalignment of the internal day and the sleep-wake cycle with respect to the outside world. So we see fluctuations in mood, irritability, anxiety, loss of empathy, where we fail to pick up the social signals from friends, family, colleagues. Frustration, risk-taking, impulsivity. So you think, yes, I can make that red traffic light. Well, no, you can't. And when you're not tired, you would never think of it. So these stupid and unreflective acts. Negative salience is really fascinating. So we now know that the tired brain forgets, to a large degree, positive experiences, but remembers negative ones. So the tired brain, the entire worldview of the tired brain is based upon remembering negative experiences. Stimulant use, of course, to override tiredness, such as caffeine, and then reversing that with alcohol, and that can blend into illegal drug use. If we look at our cognitive responses, such as our ability to focus, our memory consolidation, attention, concentration, communication, decision-making, creativity, productivity, and social connectivity, all the things that allow us to be this remarkable animal are impaired hugely as a result of lack of sleep and the misalignment of our circadian rhythms. And if we have chronic disruption, as you see in night shift workers, we see, of course, daytime sleepiness and microsleeps. It's been estimated that 100,000 crashes on the American motorway system are due every year for people for falling asleep at the wheel. Actually, other organizations suggest it's closer to 300,000. Cardiovascular disease, stroke, altered stress responses, infection, lowered immunity, cancer. The risk of cancer, for example, is now considered so strong with night shift work that the World Health Organization has designated night shift work as a potential carcinogen. It's that bad. metabolic abnormalities, type 2 diabetes, and a huge impact upon depression and psychosis. So sleep and circadian rhythm disruption is so much more than feeling tired at an inconvenient time. It essentially impacts upon our short-term and our long-term health. And again, we can unpack that more later. Now I want to consider, okay, we've said this circadian entrainment is essential, but what features of the light environment are required for entrainment? And it's complicated, and we're just really beginning to sort of grope our way forward in this area. Sunlight provides a complex sensory signal for time of day detection. So if we just think here of the changes in intensity, so from full sunlight to 120 lux, 120,000 lux, lux is a measure of light intensity, shade outside, a cloudy day, dark in the winter, twilight, deep twilight, full moon, and all the rest of it. It's an extraordinary dynamic range. And because it's so dynamic, just taking a snapshot of light intensity within the environment would not be a sensible way of aligning the internal clock with the external world. So we know it's got to be more than just a snapshot of light intensity in time. If we look at spectral changes, and this is really a really nice study. It was in fact by one of my mentors. John Lithgow wrote this beautiful book in 1979 called The Ecology of Vision. And this is from that book, I've redrawn it. And we see that the spectral changes are very different from midday to twilight. So for example, at twilight, we see this relative enrichment in the blue part of the spectrum and a drop in the orange-red part of the spectrum. And at this point, people say, well, hang on, what the heck are you talking about? Because when you look at the twilight, you see this beautiful orange-red glow. Well, that's, of course, at the horizon. But if you look at the dome of the sky, it's enriched in blue light. And so the dominant wavelength of light at twilight is blue light. And so if you were able to measure those spectral changes, you could again deduce where twilight might be, and therefore time of day. And of course, if you were able to map the relative position of the sun within the sky, spanning sunrise, noon to sunset, that would be another way in which you could use light in the environment to know what time of day it is. Okay, so the light environment is dynamic, so we should expect a sophisticated detection system. It's amazing how recent that simple concept has been. So much of the time, it's just been lights on, lights off, that's it. And what I want to show you now is kind of what we know about the complexity of these light detecting systems. So I'm going to talk about a whole range, well, not all because of time, but so if we think about it, yes, intensity, duration, wavelength, time of day, dawn versus dusk, rates of change are important signals for the regulation of the clock. And also we could add the sensory task. We talked about the circadian system, but alertness and sleep have different requirements. Light history, whether you're an agricultural worker and working outside versus people like us who stay inside all the time, like those poor plants and the teleated. Age, and I'll show you a little bit of data on age, the seasons, profoundly light changes over the seasons, and indeed the our health status. There's evidence that under certain health conditions, our thresholds for the regulation of the circadian system, the sleep-wake cycle, are different. That's very notable in mental health, schizophrenia, for example. Okay, let's look at intensity. And here we see a schematic of the range of light intensity within the environment. And I want to add on the detectors. So if we think about those rods, which provide us our black and white vision, they are exquisitely sensitive at low levels of light and saturate at around about 100 lux. So the sort of light intensity you get from a museum display case is only about 50 lux. Color vision kicks in at around about 10 lux. So, even relatively low light, you can have good color vision. What about those photosensitive retinal ganglion cells? Well, yes, they have the potential to be I'm battling with a mouse here. They have the potential of detecting low levels of light around about 100 lux, and then they can go up all the way to 100,000 lux. And the key point is made, look at this. This is in the millisecond range, rods are in the millisecond range, but for the PRGCs to function, they need minutes and hours. And I think that's a really important point. So the comparison of intensities or luminance between the visual cells and those photosensitive retinal ganglion cells is not really appropriate because it doesn't take into account the duration of light exposure, milliseconds versus minutes and hours. So if we think about duration, yes, we can get these systems to work at 100 lux, but it requires greater than 6 hours of light exposure. So again, it makes kind of sense. Twilight, as we've said, is about 50 to 100 lux, but you need to integrate that information over very long time constants. So already seeing a rather dynamic and very different set of sensory requirements compared to the rods and cones. Okay, wavelength. So I said that these photosensitive retinal ganglion cells are maximally sensitive in the blue part of the spectrum, around 480 nanometers. But, and that has then led many lighting companies to say, I'm going to use a light source that will stimulate the circadian system. But in fact, that's naive. We now know the cones have projections to those photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, as do the rods. It's a complicated network. They have bipolar cells, which then communicate with amacrine cells that communicate then with cone bipolars. But the point is that the rods and cones can modify the output of those photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. We originally conceived these as two parallel systems. Now we know they talk to each other. Okay, so what do we do? What do we make of that? Well, it means that, of course, our beautiful, pure 480 nanometer light could be greatly expanded. So there's the rods, there's a short wavelength cone, and there are two longer wavelength cones. So if you look at the dynamic range, so this broad spectral input of these photoreceptors means it's not just like a blue light receptor. And furthermore, we don't know exactly how they interact. And there was evidence from Dacey's work that the short wavelength cone might actually be inhibitory. So trying to disentangle how these different receptors are interacting to generate some sense of entrainment is a major issue at the moment. Okay, if we think of time of day. Now, this is really important. So when you see light, really matters. So here we have a light-dark cycle, and I've got a cartoon here, and you can see. Sorry. If I pull this really hard, it's probably going to fall out. So let me just, there we go. So this is a cartoon, of course. So this is sleep, nighttime. This individual is sleeping at about the same time every day. And what we see if they get dusk light is that they'll get up later the next day and go to bed later the next day. But if you get dawn light, you get up earlier and go to sleep earlier and get up earlier the next day. So when we're all agricultural workers, we're being nudged backwards and forwards by a broadly symmetrical light exposure. Of course, we live in built spaces, and many of us are deprived from one element of that light-dark cycle. And we looked a few years ago at the student population across the world, lots of different countries. And what we found is that those individuals who were going to bed late and getting up late, they were sleeping through dawn, so they didn't get the dawn signal, which would advance the clock, but they were getting the dusk signal because they were staying up late and out over twilight. And so they were getting a dusk signal. And so what that does is push the clock to a later time. So part of the problem that teenagers have is that they are having this asymmetrical exposure to light. Getting exposure is critical, and the key point is that dusk light delays, dawn light advances. So timing is critical. So if we think about the sensory task, whether it's circadian, alertness, or sleep, Now, those photosensitive retinal ganglion cells are extraordinary. They project not just to the master clock here within the suprachiasmatic nuclei, but a whole range of brain structures in the hypothalamus and the thalamus, regulating sleep, alertness, metabolic information, pupil constriction, and they also, via their projections, can actually change the sensitivity of the visual system and actually cause the release of dopamine and serotonin. So this is a hugely diverse brightness detector system. And of course, they're plugged into the sympathetic nervous system. One of the regulatory outputs will be pineal melatonin. Now, the assumption has been that these different non-image forming receptors will show the same sensitivities and dynamics, and they absolutely do not. So we can't extrapolate from one system to the other. Each has to be looked at individually. If we just look at age, which I think is another very interesting one. So what we've got here is the intensity of the stimulus. Thanks a lot. I haven't had time, obviously, to go into life history, seasons, health status, or rate of change. The point I'm trying to make is there's huge complexity here. Where's the working? Sorry about this, team. Just won't advance. I don't know. No. Oh, okay. So if we go back to my original question, do we have enough information to design human-centric lighting for the regulation of circadian rhythms and sleep in the built environment? And my emphatic answer is no. But, and I think this is a theme that Ian will develop, is we can use the information that we have to think about aspects of human-centric lighting. So I don't think we should wait until we have all the data. I think we do need to act now. And actually, the key thing, I think, as a result of our discussion is that architects and scientists like myself interact. So as the data emerges, we can integrate it within the broader design of the built space. So thank you for your attention. Okay, Ian, shall I? Yeah, I'm just going to share, and you are that one. That one. That. And then I think we can do. Where's the?
From beginning.
Okay. Do you want to go to full screen?
Well, that's yeah. So,
There we go.
Just to double check you with that screen view, because it's
That's rubbish.
yeah, go back to the original camera if you want, so that your face is bigger on it.
Oh, yeah, I'm yes.
So there you go. Then people will be able to see your face.
They can see the screen.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation, Sebastian and Sally. I've titled this talk, Light is the Opium of the Architect and Shadow Its Form. I'm not going to talk about opium and drugs specifically. That's a nice talk I do give sometimes. It's about imagination. And I will try to stay to a script because it's the only way I'll get through in 15 or 20 minutes. I put the little prince up because he comes from an asteroid. He's actually just beyond Mars. You think I'm joking? No. It's about 2 kilometers long, and in the hexadecimal numerical system, the particular planet he comes from, B612 or B612, comes from the asteroid in this particular area beyond Mars, which has got a number 46610. So you can apply the hexadecimals to that and you'll get this. Now, I mention him partly because Saint-Exupéry wrote The Little Prince, as we know, somewhat in a strange state in a desert, an unusual light environment for him as a Frenchman. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Use this. No.
Click on next.
See next. Where's next?
So there is a pop-up window over your title on this. Go down with the mouse.
Okay. Yeah, so he's out there between Mars, just beyond Mars. We now look, of course, at the sun. What can you do in 8 minutes, 15 seconds? You can wait for a photon. But interestingly, the sun at its heart is around 15 million degrees centigrade for those physicists in the room. The hottest place in the universe is actually in Oxford, at the Culham laboratories, where they have 100 million degrees centigrade. Everybody know where it is? Good. So anyway, few people know that Einstein went to South America for a few weeks, stayed 3 months, and was invited to give a talk at the Academy of Sciences in Sao Paulo. And in it, he said something along the lines that he could not accept the idea of light as exhibiting properties of both particle and wave, because the duality did not fit his theory. So he called it a reckless hypothesis at that lecture, the idea of the photon. And of course, that was the birth of the photonic age and the end of Einstein, in many ways. Can I get a click again somewhere? Yeah. So that was the sun, and then that's the wave, which I didn't show because I was reading. Rather pretty as for an architect or a designer. That's Culham laboratory. So this electrically charged plasma is the hottest place in the universe that we know of. And I did an experiment a long time ago with a physicist, Francois Bastien, and Jean-Louis Lhermitte, who was an artist, because we wanted to create a sort of fountain of light, a cascade annulaire. And with the anode and the cathode, by slight shaping and playing with different gases, krypton, argon, and others, we managed to create birds moving up in a virtual vacuum, about 0.02 of an atmosphere. And also rings. Somebody asked me, what was the point of it all? Well, it was to put inside the facade, the bioclimatic facades at La Villette, the City of Science, back in 1985, 86. Too expensive to install. But I was reminded of the Pink Floyd and growing tomatoes on the dark side of the moon and how one would get the light there. So the photonic age was born. And of course, we're talking about light, but light is used in so many fields. The photon, it's almost indistinguishable from everything else at the moment. And I got involved in designing high voltage pylons for the EDF in France. And around the electrical core are fiber optics. So all of those cables are carrying information as well as power. Then we go back to 1617. Robert Flood, Infinity, a great print, and I do etchings, So I know what a black print looks like. Of course, everybody knows Malevich's Black Square, which was some 300 years later. So what's happened to us? Go back to the Little Prince, the lamplighter. I think there's 250 something sunrises and sunsets every day. So he's very busy, so busy, he can't stop working, which brings us to us. So this is in 1800, and this is what we've done because we're so busy. So we all become lamplighters. We don't actually know how to live anymore. And it raises big questions about designing spaces for people to work and live in and sleep in. These are two windows. One is by James Turrell at the Yorkshire Sculpture Park. And the art of James's, if you like, emptiness to the sky is the thinness, the wafer-thin edge of the whole, because your eye won't pick up the edge properly. It thinks it does, a bit like clouds. The closer you get to clouds, the line of the cloud disappears. And on the left is a piece of sculpture I did not so long ago in Italy, which is just, it's saddle structures made of squares of timber joined together. But because the timber is not circular, they distort in a particular way, which I was interested in doing. But the surprise, lovely surprise, is the nonlinear activity of both the sunlight coming through, the snowfall creating these little snow cones. In other words, the aspect of non-predictability. Although if all the computers in the world were all linked up, we'd actually be able to predict exactly how these snowflakes from every leaf would fall off a tree, but we don't. And this, I would suggest, is going off piece again on my talk, where a common understanding of beauty exists. It's not beauty in the eye of the beholder, but in our DNA, the same way we have red, green, blue, we all have a common understanding of what's beautiful. And I would suggest it's the way nature gives it to us, whether it's light dancing on water that's moving, or the way leaves are changing color and falling off a tree. And then there's the other wavelengths that happens in nature, which are not ours, the way that different insects see and the wavelengths that they have. And it suggests to me that we could have the possibility of lighting our paths in urban parks with bioluminescent fungus rather than lamps. And our eyes, I would suggest, and our brains, would attune to that light level. So I'm now rapidly going through various bits of our work. One of them was about the impact of eyesight and the visual, which is what concerns most architects, and touch. And I was very intrigued that Kubrick, in his film in 2001, had the astronaut touch the monolith. And yet we know the glove is full of electronics, probably. But why does he need to touch? It's because we actually get more information through touch than we do through our eyes. Now, that's not to say that we get more information in life, but in the specifics of eye and touch and skin, we get more through the skin. And as Russell knows, and I think others, that 90% of the information we do get is through the eye in total. But of that 90%, our brain only uses 10% of it because it's already got the information. And this leads to the idiot behavior of the brain and how it affects, as Russell mentioned, the fact that we get a bit tired and we crash a car or we do stupid things. It's our brain behaving unilaterally, I'd suggest. Building on the right is the Plymouth Theatre Royal Production Centre. It's everything other than a theatre. It's where you make stuff. But because it was by the waterside and King Charles III insisted on having a public walkway along the edge because he felt he owned this new land that was made, gave me the idea of having a soft building, a soft metal jacket, one that you could press and would change color. It's bronze, phosphor bronze, and uses 10% of the amount of copper you'd use if you're using a 3mm copper sheet for the building, which of course Oxford's full of. This is an economic way of using material, and it's tactile. And then the cold steel here, stainless steel, of an equatorial sundial, except by taking the ring around the gnomon, the ring then casts a shadow on the gnomon, leaving the ring free at the base for the children to learn how to read the movement of the earth around the sun. So it's an expensive toy for children. But the way light enters buildings is, in a way, I would suggest, the history of architecture in itself. It's not about mud, earth, cooking, making bricks, going and cutting stone. The architecture that we enjoy, especially the ones that give us awe, a sense of atmosphere, is because of the way light is manipulated with the skin of the building and the way it enters the building. Now, this is Sinan, who is my favorite architect. I suggest most European architects, when I mention his name, have never heard of him. He basically created the architecture of Istanbul as the Ottoman Empire grew. And he was both engineer, hydrologist, and architect. And here on the right, you can see the scale of light that was being achieved in the 16th century in Constantinople, Istanbul. On the left is the interesting one for me, because it's the Aix-en-Chapelle, the Aachen choir behind the altar. And when you look at it, it is almost entirely of glass. And this is the era when light became critical. It started around the Gothic period of 1200 with Abbé Sugar at Saint-Denis in Paris. And it's the Abbé Saint-Denis, which is the royal chapel, the French. And he had a Madonna. But he wanted more light to come into the Saint-Denis, and he invented the Gothic arch. Wasn't an architect. And Louis VII came in with his family, his entourage. And because Abbé Sugar had noticed how pale and dirty the Virgin Mary was, painted it with lapis lazuli, a rather brilliant blue. And the king thought, that's the color I want for our clothes. So all the royal family from then on, blue became the royal color. But it was simply because you couldn't see the Virgin Mary amongst the dirty environment of the light that was now invading this particular building. And because light is color, some clever architects have managed to communicate through color the structural forces going on. This is in Sagrada Familia in Barcelona. The different colors of the stones, the black, the pink, I can't see the whitish, are carrying different loads from the roof to the ground. And then there's, of course, darkness. Where would light be without the dark? Nowhere. We wouldn't understand it. And exploiting it is one of the great tricks of architects. And yet in the last, I would say, 40 years, 4 decades, architects have become besotted with form rather than space. So it's been a sort of an architectural gymnastics of who can do the most complex form possible, using parametric modeling or whatever other forms of maths you want to use. And yet the art of light and understanding what the light is doing when it comes into your building is the most critical. The drawing I did after it was constructed, or being constructed rather, of the Leipzig Glass Hall. I had learned at La Villette in doing the facade, the biochromatic facades, that about 10% of obstruction to the sky keeps a sense of transparency. Once you go above that, 15, 20% of structure against the sky, or of opacity against the sky, that transparency goes. And in Leipzig, I contained it to about the 10%. And it seems that looking for the poem I wrote at the time was to bring the arc of the sky to earth. And in this sense, this arc gave the form. It also represents, in the same way that perhaps domes do, the cosmos. That's the La Villette, which was predated it by 15 years. So I want to, in a way, end on light and beauty, which I touched on already. This search for the non-linearity in architecture, which directly relates to Russell's point about the dynamic of light and how the brain responds to and needs that dynamic to work. Just thought I'd show that because I think most people find that beautiful, just to make my point. Now I've got to get rid of it.
It is indeed broken.
Yes, I just stop there. No? Oh, yes, sorry. So something like working with Anne Pay at the Louvre on the sculpture courts and the pyramids, we conceived the idea for him of the upside down pyramid, which I called a single piece of chandelier. And we left the edges of the glass cut at 45 degrees. So you have the prism. So the light comes in the top and you get rain rods. They're not curved rainbows, they're straight line spectrums. And of course that is moving all the time. Very simple idea. When looking at those courtyards, which are going to have sculpture in, I looked up I got introduced to D'Alembert, who was unknown to me back in the 1980s. And I don't know if people are familiar, but he is the scientific author of all of the first Encyclopedia Universelle. And he had this thing in the middle, which has got nothing to do with light at all, but I think it's enlightenment. It's the same as, I can't remember the president's library in Washington. Help. Doesn't matter. He broke down all human knowledge into memory, imagination, and reasoning, and constructed the encyclopedia on that base. Jefferson Library has the same structure. And we had a little formula. And I went down to the Arts and Métiers library to look up this formula for very simple maths in the end, about how far an object should be away from a source of light, like my finger now on this table or on the screen, in which I can get rid of the sharp shadows and get into the penumbra, the antumbra. And that gives the softness of the shadow, which would fall on the sculpture below. So the distance was about 18 meters, and it left me with a tube, if you like, on the right-hand part of the drawing, of about 150 millimeters in diameter. That would ensure that there would be no interruption, if you like, on the sculpture by hardline shadows. Unfortunately, Pay didn't think we could actually make this glass roof work, having done it just up the road in Paris at La Villette. But I don't know, being American, maybe he just wanted another idea. So we ended up with a diagram on the left, and the blue dots represent solar shading, which you see in many atria of architects. They only have sort of like 1990 was glass is the answer. What was the question? And so you'll find atria in a lot of modern buildings, and they're all glass, and then they get covered with shadow, shading, taking away the sky. Instead of taking a small amount of glass that's clear to the sky, adequate not to overheat the space, and still have the view, and not spend a fortune on shading and maintenance. Pay decided on these parallels, which are tubes about that diameter, and leaving a slot all the way along with insulation inside so it absorbs the sound energy, as well as shade. And it sort of worked, but not as well as I'd hoped. As you can see here on the right, the sharper shadows coming through from the edge, but generally there's a diffused nature to the light in the space. The non-linearity again, here in Terrasson-la-Ville-Dieu in the middle of France, which is very close to the Lascaux caves. And here we have the first idea of caves and original habitation, living in the dark with a very bright entrance somewhere. And the paintings in Lascaux cave given that they were largely lit inside by fire, by the flame with the movement of air, you got the flickering candle. And some French people not that long ago have discovered that when you actually place a flickering candle in front of those Lascaux paintings, and you know there's various things like deer falling over each other, it turns into an animation of movement of the deer jumping into the river. I mentioned this one because we brought in just rocks so that they can be inhabited by animals and plants. And it contrasts completely with this very slick, clinical, flat glass roof with high maintenance, cold, etc. But again, this is just illustrative of this non-linearity, this dynamic. So this is corten, which is copper added to steel a little bit. And it rusts differently, it darkens, it changes. And similarly here in Plymouth, which I've mentioned already. And the Sainsbury Wellcome Center for Neuroscience at UCL has a facade which Russell is enamored with because it's white. And if you walk around a city in the daytime, all windows are dark. It's very depressing, especially in this sort of climate. Why not have white buildings? How do you make them white? Well, you use glass. Here we use cast glass, insulated, glass internal lining as well, enabling the whole facade to be a white wall for scientists to write on. And this project is just completing in Malta. And Russell mentioned, or I think, Sebastian mentioned sculpting architecture with the sun, sort of nature's laser. Is if you understand that movement, that geometry really well, you can construct a building with static elements here in Malta, which control solar energy gain, but don't inhibit the daylighting levels required inside. The building management system in this building was set with no daylighting, no artificial lighting during daylight hours. Now, obviously there's the dusk and the dawn bit. A number of companies moved in and immediately asked for the BMS to be changed because they're used to having lights on during the daytime. And after a month or two, they've all started switching them off because they realize it does work. And interestingly, they had in this summer, 45 degrees for 7 days on the trot, and they haven't got any air conditioning. They got chilled slabs with water at 16 degrees. And the cool falls like from the sky in a way. And there's nothing on the ceiling. There's no smoke detector, sensor, security, light fittings. There's nothing on the ceiling in these buildings. It's a white zen surface on which you can actually look and calm down. And at night, we use uplighters, which we designed specifically for the project with an Italian company. My only regret is we can't change the color temperature. But it's set where you get around 300 lux at about this height, 250 at work height, which is actually too much, if I'm honest. But Castaldi, the Italian, said, well, we won't market it unless it gives that. And that's based on certain heights of the rooms. And I go back to daylight. This is the Royal Academy of Music, performance space, and it's a bit like an emoji on the right. It's a happy emoji, one central light, and a window, which is not shown in this picture, which takes the setting sun across the performer performing on the piano. The theatre goes back to 1600s, Shakespeare's time, band, bad boys, prostitution, drugs. So they had to go indoors, which is why you have Blackfriars and Whitefriars, and that's where theatre was performed. And that's where you don't have natural light. They had no longer natural light. They worked with a candle that time. And that's how the entr'acte appeared. And the length of acts in Shakespeare's plays was how long does a candle last if we had to change them. A light cloth made of fibre optics, fractured fibre optics randomly, and stainless steel wire. And then the monument in Ireland, Dublin, I call it celestial acupuncture. That's my nearest notion to opium. It's not conducting light like a mirror. It's taking the softness by treating the surface of the stainless steel. Shot peening, it's called. So you can get a blackness against the sky, a real blackness, and a light in the daytime. That's a close-up of the shot peening on the right. It's a bit like the principle of velvet. If you have the depth in the surface and the angles are shifting, it will absorb light, so it will go darker. So we had more sunsets than I thought. So anyway, the lamplighter was a tragedy in many ways, but at least he had a job. A couple of my little anecdotal aphorisms. So I'm going to quote Tanizaki, who wrote this in the 1960s, a book called In Praise of Shadows. The quality that we call beauty, however, it must always grow from the realities of life, and our ancestors, forced to live in dark rooms, presently came to discover beauty in shadows, ultimately guide shadows towards beauty's end. They often have a plain earth wall or an opaque wall in a Japanese home, nothing on it. And they will look, a bit like looking at television, and watch the changing light quality on that wall. The wall is not smooth, it's textured. Today, we can have a virtual fire on your screen. You can have the crackle of the sound of the fire whilst you're working, and you feel warmer, apparently, according to Ava, who's here. Discovered about a week ago when she was cold in her flat house. Decided to put this one on her monitor and psychologically felt warmer. I remember seeing this 20 odd years ago at the Virgin Lounge at Heathrow Airport, midsummer, and I couldn't understand why they had a screen with a fire on it. But because they placed this column and it looked like a fireplace. After World War II. But we did do a light, a task light, which has two temperatures. And bottom right, you can see a sun and a moon as the buttons, and you can play from 1 lux up to 500 lux with your task lamp. So you can actually go back to the candle. My question in designing the insides of buildings is less light, more light, in fact. Our brains actually, in our biology, want less light. And this addiction to light that we've got, like the opium I mentioned at the beginning, is perhaps wrong. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these two extraordinarily rich and inspiring talks that are talking to each other in explicit and more subcutaneous ways. And I was particularly intrigued to spark a discussion among the two of you. What you make of the question of whether there is already something like anthropocentric lighting. And Russell, you said, no, we don't have anthropocentric lighting. Well, in Ian's talk, with these pictures of light pollution, there seemed to be an answer that we might have too much anthropocentric lighting or anthropocentric lighting in the wrong way. And to kick off the discussion, I would bring back these questions and hear what you think after hearing each other's talk.
I'd like maybe just to add, more going outside of architecture to an urban environment. And they hear.
Yes, but perhaps if you'd like to say a word.
Yes, please come to the.
Yes, just bring in the chairs.
And we'll have a discussion for about 15 minutes and then open up to the floor.
Yeah, so I was going to say that without talking about architecture, we're talking about how we make our cities or towns. And imagine that every road is an outdoor room and its walls are made of buildings. facades of buildings. So first move is the facade of those buildings really should be in the public domain in terms of partial decision making. And this is why we go to planning permission. What's it going to look like? But in Berlin, about 20 years ago, they passed a law which said we're going to reduce the amount of street lighting in Berlin by 50%. Public reaction, people are going to die, cars are going to hit people more, cyclists are going to get in October. Result, accidents right down. Because people didn't realize that cars have lights. And they illuminate the road going along. Most cyclists do, not all. But in England, what do we like with our lampposts? The road, not the pavement, where people are. Totally wrong, bananas. So already we have a light pollution level of our built environment that's A, too much, and B, in the wrong place. Not bad for starting.
So how did that happen?
Ignorance.
Okay.
Pure ignorance. I think it must have started with the first street lamps being associated with the vehicles, those vehicles not having adequate light up front. Horses and cars. That's what I'm saying. Oh, but I don't know at the time of horses and cars, we had gas lamps. And before that, we had no light. We had no light before that. But then we didn't have big town there, villages. But anyway, that's another story. But the other thing that's interesting about light and our urban environment is when in the 30s, 20s and 30s, pylons were being built to bring people electricity and a lamp in their home, nobody complained about the beauty of the pylon, the ugliness of the pylon. When we came to design these ones in France, oh boy, your whole raison d'etre for the EDF was selling X amount of kilowatts to Spain across the Pyrenees. There's a valley, bottom of France, just before the Pyrenees, and there are some English people there and they objected. So hence the big competition. The pylons are not the problem, even if the aesthetics change. Our perception of aesthetics change. It's the catenary cable carrying the power to light your home, because they do that in the landscape. Everything else that we've ever made reads the landscape. Whether it's a viaduct with its cone or even a motorway, it's actually following the landscape. But those catenary cables don't. Anyway, that's the background to we need power to buildings and houses. We make so many mistakes.
We've touched on two areas. We've touched on optimizing light for the regulation of sleep and circadian rhythms. And your talk focused on the aesthetic more than that. And as a result of some of the discussions we had earlier, in fact, as we pointed out, most people don't have a sleep problem. They have an anxiety or a stress-related problem, which then kicks into their sleep. And so making a building very beautiful and relaxing with light actually does improve sleep, because you can then relax more and you're far less anxious, either in the domestic space or indeed in the workspace.
Well, this is where humanity needs science.
Yeah. But has that been
recognized?
Yeah.
I don't think so, because even mentioning that we have a common understanding of aesthetics, a baseline of aesthetics, I don't think it's common knowledge at all. Certainly not amongst architects. Which is why you have these debates about new buildings and new proposals within planning committees and so on amongst lay people. They don't know what they're judging. Not even the architects, frankly. And so that's why I wanted to mention the urban environment, because each building we make is making the urban environment work better or not. And once you move into this last 4 decades, they're throwing up eye-catching whatever. It has nothing to do with urbanism. And therefore, it's undermining that sense of, let's say, relaxed feeling you might get running down a Georgia Street or in some of the older streets of Oxford. You get a continuity of either material or rhythm or structure, which isolated buildings, as we've had in the last 40 years, don't give at all. And I think all art, poetry, painting, sculpture, architecture, fundamental structure, rhythm.
And music. But I think it's important for the audience to hear the process. We're talking about this extraordinary building at the Sainsbury Wellcome Center. We showed some images. And how that arose from a dialogue between scientists, neuroscientists, and yourself. And I think it's really worth talking about how the fact that your brief to the client was give me a year.
Well, the brief we got was how would you go about designing neuroscience laboratories for the next 60 years? It would last the next 60 years. So I took the question as, how would you go about, as against design? Our competitors all designed buildings and models and the rest of it. We drew not one single line of the building. We wrote down a research program in 1 year, which was an enjoyable idea from our perspective, because we go around the world, meet neuroscientists who are leading their particular fields of neuroscience, it's a very diverse field, and talk with them and understand what they're trying to do. And also ask great questions, where's it going to go? 60 years. One of the great answers I got was from Richard Axel. Where's it, what are you trying to find out? Richard Axel replied, said, why don't you get a prefrontal lobe? Where can it come from? Okay. And then Fred Gage at Salk Institute, and he helped set up the first neuro architecture kind of seminar back in 2003-4. I asked him, I would like to design a staircase, but I'd like people to go up rather than down. What do I do? It's just a good question. So that research led me into a whole world of discovery, new thinking, new ideas. And I think those neuroscientists, in particular on the Sainsbury Wellcome Center, where our acting director, client was John O'Keefe. We got the Nobel halfway through it. Okay. And his idea of space, for those not familiar, he's the one attributed with identifying the place cell in the hippocampus, which I think is combined with 3 or 4 other cells. There's a boundary cell, a head direction cell, and an XYZ cell, which was discovered by the Mosels, who worked previously in John's lab. His idea of space was focused there when we first met. My idea of space was coming out from outer space. So he was looking through his microscope, and I was looking through the telescope. So I was looking backwards, and he was looking forward. And yet we had to reverse roles in the funny sort of thing. We had to go forward with our thinking. But the language that we eventually got going together took a few months. And he described it, we both became neural architects. That was a nice description.
I mean, what you achieved in terms of design has translated into the people who live in that building as being a really nice place to live.
Yeah, and John wrote me a letter about 3 months ago. Actually, he did as well. In which he described the fact that the scientists absolutely love working. And it deals with a lot of people who are kind of autistic. So some of them want to work under their desk rather than at their desk. Others want tall spaces, shallow spaces, long spaces, and they can adapt their spaces. That's the great beauty of the building. It's adaptable. Can it be adaptable economically? Yes. It is designed where the scientists and the people who work in it do that work themselves. Move the plugs, move the valves, and rather than wait for UCL maintenance to turn up 3 months later and charge them £5,000 for moving a plug. And that's the way we approach that design. But I think, and spiritually, it was best put by Adam Kampf, who's a neuroscientist, currently working on a project that I initiated by accident by saying I'm fed up with screens 5 years ago. Our brains work in 3D and we look at 2D screens all the time, everywhere. Why can't we have a 3D no screen? He's on the case. It's interesting. And his 5-year-old daughter, Alice, actually demonstrated it about 2 years before COVID. Really impressive. He described the building as akin to the brain, For neuroscientists, the brain has no scale, it's scale-free. And he felt this building had that quality, even though it's very physical.
So what I was alluding to in my presentation about this whole concept of human-centric lighting. And it gets me quite irritated because unlike what you've heard from Ian, who actually designs these spaces with light very much in mind, what many architects do is they go to a lighting company and just say, oh, we're just going to install human-centric lighting, not thinking about the natural light or the dynamic nature of light.
Stick the lights in.
Stick the lights in. And I think we're seeing a big tension there because Ian doesn't do that. And my concern is that you go to these lighting engineers and they think they can deliver the solution to the problem. And what it does is, in my view, is it prevents architects from thinking about the nature of the building and how light should be an essential part of it.
We had this conversation early on because Russell was on the governing council, full of very nice people, unfortunately.
Broadly speaking. They were much nicer after a glass of wine sometimes.
What was interesting is that I, very early on in talking with Russell, this whole wavelength, this 480 nanometers came up. And I thought of making little pods, maybe a couple of pods in the building, where you could go for a photonic shower at 480 nanometers and turn the temperature up or down at wavelength. And Russell said, well, make sure you put a warning on the outside of this pod. Do not use after 11 o'clock in the morning. Otherwise, it will screw your fire with the rest of the day.
But I do think we should make some pods. I think it'd be a great idea.
So, no, but the range of conversations one has as an architect with really nice, intelligent people gives you all the clues. It's when you've got your formulaic as an architect or people are entrenched with their dogma about what they think the science is, like lighting, you go nowhere, absolutely nowhere. And in my career, I probably turned down more jobs than I've actually done, just because they're actually boring people, boring clients. So I'm quite selective personally about who I like to work with. And in fact, you talked me earlier, we went for a competition up in Cumbria and to do with memory, well-being. Russell, I asked to join the team. I asked Tom Thurgood, who's the director of the Sainsbury Wellcome Center, to join. We didn't get shortlisted. Some of the feedback said, well, we didn't understand your team. They're the wrong client for us.
But I suppose we should finish by, well, what do I get out of you? So we've talked a lot about how neuroscientists can influence architecture, the changing biology, but I think it's also important to realize that the undiluted joy of seeing one's science translated into something that is useful and helpful is something that's wonderful. So I think that many neuroscientists are delighted to interact because of that, the undiluted joy of translation.
I think that in the Sainsbury Wellcome Center, that translation is getting better, slowly better. There's only a few things used in building. I took the nerve of painting all the other side of the concrete slab blue with a paint that goes as a silicate that goes into the concrete. The only blue they had one blue. And I asked Russell to come up with a spectrometer to the office. He did. And we read it, and do you know what? It was 480 nanometers.
Yeah.
That's just extraordinary.
How about that was spooky?
It's like a service underneath the service activity. Services are, but there's no secret. Is this blue? And it doesn't overcook because they're not seeing doing that. Although Adam Camp, interestingly, did used to take 15 minutes in the morning when he came in.
Yeah. That's what I do in my office. But I think we now reach that time where we open up for questions. Is that right, Sebastian?
Yes, that's exactly right. So thank you for your thoughts, and the floor is open for questions.
Sebastian,
I'll move to the fore here
and select.
and maybe we have some questions online as well.